Genesis House and the Friends in Recovery podcast are proud to bring you Answering the Call, the First Responder podcast. Join your hosts, Mike the Podfather and Jersey Ed, as they address the real issues in health and wellness for first responders, from physical and mental health to relationships and work-life balance. We leave no stone unturned. Answering the Call, the First Responder podcast is available on Facebook, Podbean, iTunes, and YouTube, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, here are your friends in recovery answering the call.
Hey everybody, welcome to Answering the Call, the First Responders podcast. I am the Podfather.
And I'm Jersey Ed.
Jersey Ed, how are you?
Good. You're way down there, Mike.
I'm way down here. We
had to put an extension on this fucking table today for this one. So
what type of table was that?
Leave it to Ed to throw the F-bomb up.
That's right. You have to get it in at the beginning. So we just got done with the show with Megan, and she was she kind of set the bar too high. So I got to start them right away now.
Well, it's good to be here. We have a couple of guests today.
We got a longtime friend of ours on the show with us.
We do, but before we start any of that, I think you have a little business to take care of.
You're remembering that, huh?
I'm remembering.
Wow, you're pretty good, Mike. Podfather. That's why they call you the Podfather.
The Podfather.
All right. Well, we'd like to thank Genesis House, of course, for answering the call. It is a part of our Friends in Recovery series. Answering the Call is powered by your likes, follows, subscribes, and shares. Follow us on social media and help us get the word out and leave us a review. Remember, 5-star review is important. And we're always looking for speakers. So if you're out there in law enforcement or any first responders that you want to get on the show in recovery or not, this is more of a wellness show, a well-being show, or just an informational show on first responders. You don't have to be in recovery to get on the show. But we want to hear your stories. And we have a couple guests with us today.
We do.
And we have Jeff Zeizel, who's a longtime friend of the Friends in Recovery series.
One of the originals.
Yes, he was. And
founding member.
That's right.
Founding
Pioneer.
Member. 2 years now, Jeff. We've been doing this.
2 years. That's
for Friends in Recovery, the addiction podcast. And this is our new endeavor. You've never been on this show with us.
No, it's about time.
We had to work out some issues here, and
my agent was a tough negotiator.
We had to work out some legal issues that we had to get you back on the show. So,
well, I'm on the bracelet now.
Oh, that's good. And you brought a friend with you, Jeff.
Yes, he did. And want me to introduce her?
Yeah,
please.
Ann Perriello.
Perriello.
That's close.
Perriello.
Perriello.
Yeah. Ann is a police. Ann, you tell us what you are. I'm sorry.
Sure. I'm a lieutenant at the Pelham, New Hampshire Police Department. Part of coming here with Jeff and with Mike and Ed is I'm also in my second year of a MSW program, so
That's
a master's
correct.
in social work.
Very impressed. Just the idea that you're going in that direction, and you're almost a 19-year veteran police officer.
I am.
Which is, in and of itself, says a lot about your ability to handle stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
It's been a couple incidents.
I bet.
And Jeff, people don't know you on this podcast, so why don't you just introduce yourself and
Sure.
real quick.
Thanks, Ed. So I'm a clinical social worker, and I do a lot of work with the law enforcement community. I happen to be the clinician for the DEA in New England. I also covered New York City for like 10 years. So I've been with them about 18 years, and I'm the EAP clinician for many police departments. I've been working with law enforcement about 25 years. Interestingly, back in the day, we could sort of spin off of this conversation, when police officers had traumatic events, they never really knew what to do with them. I started seeing guys because I saw a lot of police officers who had addiction problems, and then they realized that, the addiction part may be related to traumatic events, so we started developing some treatment protocols. But I have a practice. I work with a lot of local police departments. Ann and Mike have sent me many officers to help treat, and we do the best we can with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Jeff's been around a long time. And,
very instrumental and helpful throughout my career. And believe me, I've sent a lot of people that have been very successful. They love it. They love Jeff. They love going to see Jeff. Jeff's got a great staff, and he does a lot for law enforcement, corrections, EMS, and fire.
Yeah. Yep. Real quick, I want to give us our podcast, Jersey Ed's podcast pick of the week, Mike. It is a friend of ours. We all know him on the show, except for maybe you, Ann. You may not know Brian Casey. If you do, please stand up. So Brian Casey was one of our original guests on this show on Answering the Call, and he started a podcast. I guess we inspired him. Yeah. It's called Cop Think Podcast. The host is Brian Casey. He explores current issues in policing and focuses on questions: why do officers do what they do? He's on Spotify and iTunes right now, and I guess any podcast catcher, but it's called Cop Think Podcast, and it's excellent. Brian Casey, yeah, he has a lot of knowledge in this field, and Brian likes to really kind of get into the cops' minds and the wellness of the police officers out in St. Paul. Right. He runs the EAP program. Right. You know him, Jeff.
Yes. So actually, Brian and I first met because I think, Ed, you had a relationship with a friendship through Genesis House, and Brian and I were talking on the phone, and we sort of clicked pretty quickly. And I said, Brian, you should come out to Boston. There's a great conference on trauma, psychological trauma, with Basil Vanderkoff. So Brian came out a couple years back, and he and I spent a lot of time together. We went to the conference, and he wrote a book called Good Cop, Good Cop,
yes. Right.
which is really about how the job in law enforcement really can be remarkably debilitating to police officers. As a matter of fact, there it is.
Here it is. Say it, everybody.
And
good cop, good cop.
It's really, and he has this whole thing, which is based upon his podcast, which is about how cops think. And, some of the things we talked about earlier about breaking down the stigma that, you get exposed to traumatic experiences, it really negatively impacts you. Maybe not that moment, but eventually it does wear you out. And Brian has done a lot of work. Before him being a police officer, he was actually an EMT. Mm-hmm. So those are the unsung heroes because they don't get all the glory, but they see the results of all the traumatic events.
Absolutely.
And Mike, as in the city of Lowell, there's so many events. In fact, there was a statistic because I was talking to the one of the EMTs out of Lowell. They had 6,000 calls last year.
Imagine.
And that was just fentanyl and drug-related calls. Just fentanyl.
That's in 365 days. They had 6,000 calls.
So if you have 10 calls a day, that's 3,600. Right. They have almost 20 calls a day.
Right.
Wow.
So those guys get terrible exposure.
It's so true. And, people don't realize, and the money they make, they don't make near as much as a police officer and firemen make, or correctional officers. And it's really a shame because their training is so extensive. They save lives, basically. Mm-hmm. I mean, they bring people back to life. I've seen it happen, and just an amazing career. And a lot of those people are getting a little more recognition now. But the stress and the anxiety and the high rate of addiction and suicide is just rampant.
Well, Brian and I went on a drive along with Brian a couple of years ago out in St. Paul, and every time we went on a call, the EMT and fire department were there also. And the EMT, it didn't matter what the call was, but the EMTs are those guys are always, like you said, the first ones on the scene, and they get the least of the recognition out there. You know,
Ian, up in Pelham, when you go on a call like a medical emergency, is it the fire department that comes with their trained EMS, or do you have an ambulance company that contracts with Pelham?
No, the fire department is both EMS and fire. In any medical call, any fire call, the police officers go. I think that's why part of my motivation at this point to get into social work and couple that with law enforcement is first responders as a whole. They need some outlets. They need to know that wellness is number one, and it needs to start from day one. And that's in academies. That's the fire academy, the police academy, you name it. There's not enough resources out there.
Well, you know what? We say this on the show, and I met with a couple impressive gentlemen yesterday down in Princeton, New Jersey, at Princeton House, their first responders program. And we were talking about, and we always say this on the show, you guys protect yourself with guns, you guys protect yourself with vests, the best equipment in the car, whatever you guys have, dogs, whatever it is, but we don't let you guys protect your minds. And, you guys are out there protecting us. I'm a civilian, I'm not a cop, but you guys are out there protecting us. And, what happens when you guys aren't okay in your own mind, and that kind of, puts the job kind of says, okay, let's not do that. And I'm happy to hear all this recognition that a lot of these places are doing, they're taking care of the health and wellness of the first responders, especially police officers.
It's interesting because in the old days, Mike, and not as old days, Ann, when you first got on, You're welcome. When you first got on, and when you went through the academy, there was probably no training about officer wellness. There was no training on stress management. There was no training on mindfulness or dealing with psychological events, just in terms of officers' well-being. But now we actually see that's very different. I know both of you have spoken at the various academies, and Mike, you've been speaking at the Northern Essex Academy, sponsored through Methuen, for a number of years, and also spoke. And I think you both help those cadets realize that if you don't take care of yourself early on, you get sort of banged up at the end. And historically, what would police officers do after a bad call when they went off the shift? They did choir practice.
Right, exactly.
And if you work
Choir went and drank.
That's right. That's what we
Is
call
that what
it.
choir practice
That's what
is?
choir
Yes,
practice is.
that's choir practice.
Okay.
That's code, Ed.
Cool. All right.
Pay attention. So
I know the law from the other end.
yeah, that's right. Yes, you do.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that now it's okay to talk about this stuff.
Sure.
And Mike, I'd be curious when you think back when you had, and Ann as well, when you had bad calls, what was done to help the officers?
Yeah, there was very little done. I'll just speak on my, my career. 28 years in a cruiser, 4 to 12 shifts. So that never varied. I worked 4 to 12 for 28 years in a cruiser, and I'm happy I did. But there was some pitfalls along the way. When I was in the military police back in the 70s in the U.S. Army, I got interested in reading these books by a Joseph Wambaugh, who was a Los Angeles police officer.
Thin Blue Line.
Thin Blue Line.
Onion Field.
Yeah, the Onion Field, the Glitter Dome, on and on. But The New Centurions, one of the first books I ever read. And, they talked about choir practice, going out drinking. And basically that's what I did when I first got on the job is everybody drank. And I'm from the top on down, from the captain running the shift to the guy turning the key for the prisoners in the cells. We'd all meet after work and we'd drink. And good or bad, that's just how they dealt with it. And the rate of suicide in law enforcement has gone up over the years, and it's so obviously there's a great need for this. And Jeff, you've been, and I don't mean to keep patting you on the back, but
No, feel free.
I just know from all the people that when I was looking for direction before I had my practice and everything, I met you, and you've just always been very gracious and helpful, and people relate to you, the cops and everybody I've sent to you relates to you because you really know this profession. And you're 20 years is a long time. I mean, what did you do in your era?
At the start, and I'm still in it, obviously. At the start, it was choir practice. I think things are changing. There's definitely a transition. Like 10 years ago, I responded to the death of a child. Child was killed on Halloween night. It took us quite a while to put together a debriefing and just kind of walk everyone through. Once that debriefing was done, you were supposed to just go back to work and just do your thing. Right. Events like that, psychologically, they affect people for the rest of their life. So now, part of my motivation, I was on that call, is making sure that we have debriefings, making sure that you talk to your officers and put things out about wellness and what is wellness. Wellness is self-care. And then you need to break self-care down because we take care of other people, but we don't necessarily take care of ourselves.
Correct.
So if you're working the midnights, are you drinking water? Are you eating healthy? It's so easy. You mentioned in another podcast how you just end up eating junk. If you're not prepping and bringing the proper food to your shifts, you're going to just end up ordering takeout and you're going to eat junk, and eventually that's going to keep up with you. Yeah. I just started journaling in a new book. I think his name is David Amen. It is Change Your Brain, Change Your Body.
Yeah,
and
Dr. David Amen, yes.
Yeah, very powerful, and it is completely has brought me and grounded me a bit. And it's like you write down everything you're going to eat on one side of the page. The other side is, what are you grateful for today? How many automatic negative thoughts are you having? What motivated you today? Are you doing things to make your brain better, to make your body better, to keep you surviving in this profession? And that's where it has to go at this point. Right. We do debriefings. We just had a church shooting in Pelham in October. I happened to be on duty on a Saturday morning, which I work Monday through Friday normally. Without talking about the event itself, I was the first one through the door. I was in plain clothes. And that next, I think it was about 6 days, like physiologically, the adrenaline that was flushing through my body was unbelievable. It took me till the next Friday night where I finally crashed and actually got a good night's sleep. That stuff I can talk, and I'm not afraid to tell the guys my adrenaline's flowing, I'm running on fumes, keep going. But we have a very supportive environment at that point, and we talk. I almost force it without forcing it. I don't tell people they have to talk. We recommend debriefings, but debriefings happen regularly.
And you know, if you don't have these debriefings and like Brian Casey, the wellness of police officers, and you too, Ann, as far as, you know, guiding these guys, what Mike was talking about before was suicide. That's a big thing on our show is suicide. We talk about it a lot, but some statistics I got here. 2019 law enforcement losses. Okay, I'll read you just the top 5. Suicide: 225 law enforcement officers committed suicide. Number 2 was gunfire, automobile crash, 23. And then heart attacks, 16, and it goes down the list. Struck by a vehicle, 911, but and they only go down to single digits. But suicides, 225 guys committed suicide. You know,
so that includes that information that is from Blue Help, which is a group organization in Worcester from Karen Solomon, whose husband's a Worcester police officer, and they start tracking data because one of the things that happens with suicide, we talked earlier about stigma, people don't want to acknowledge that suicide is actually a death like any other type of illness. So you die of cancer, you die of heart disease, diabetes. Suicide is an illness. It's a mental illness, which doesn't inherently mean that people who take their lives are, quote, crazy. They're not. They have a disorder. And there is a profile that goes with suicidality. And we worry sometimes about police officers after they see terrible things. You know, they can't get it out of their head, and they often go down, as I say, the dark vortex, and they isolate and they sort of make some poor choices. But we do know that the 225 people who killed themselves, were they preventable? You know, we don't want to second guess ourselves, but we do know that it's really important to do suicide prevention out there, and that's part of what takes place now in the police academies. And Mike and Ann, when you spoke, you talked about some of those things about taking care of oneself and relying upon others and using the EAP and the stress programs. And, you know, Mike, you were the stress officer at LOPD for many years. You know, when we see bad calls, we try to respond, you know, quickly. And I know, Ann, after the church shooting, you brought in a team of people to debrief all those who were involved, and it's very critical that it takes place. If you ask a police officer, gee, do you want to go for a debrief and talk to the department shrink, what's the answer?
I'm going to say no.
Exactly.
Of course. I'm
So
fine.
that's right. I don't need it.
fine,
I'm all set. You know, screw that guy.
Yeah, I ain't
So,
talking to him or her.
what
Fuck
do they
that.
know?
Stay away from them.
Yeah.
But now we know that it's actually very important, and we've always known that.
Yeah, but that stigma has to be kind of pushed away from the academy on. We need more training in the academy and letting these guys know. I know, Mike, you did some training, but what did they give you, a day at the academy? This should be a fucking course in the academy for these guys, because eventually every academy, you know, if there's a large academy, we're probably going to lose somebody through it, and suicide is obviously those numbers from Blue Help. It's going to be probably suicide.
Right. The Department of Justice has done some surveys as well, studies, and with corrections. I was the EAP at the Sheriff's Department in Middlesex County, which is one of the biggest sheriff's departments in the country. I was very fortunate. I did that for 3.5 years. And their study that was completed in 2017 has very similar stats. But, you know, for a guy that was a cop for 35 years, I can honestly say that the progressiveness of learning and being taught and given the right tools to work with, you know, police officers that have all these horrific issues they have to deal with, and then their mental health, you know, is obviously going to be challenged. But it starts at the top. You have to have good administrators, and it's changing now. It is. I had a chief, Bill Taylor, Kenny LaValle. Those two chiefs, they bought into it. You know, they knew it. You know, Jeff is very familiar with the chief of Methuen, who's a kind of a pioneer in helping cops, Chief Solomon. And you know, I just think it's important that we are seeing that change now, because years ago, if the administration didn't want you to have it, you wouldn't have it. And your chief as well, Mr. Rourke, Joe Rourke, very, very intelligent guy. Very, I'm sure he buys into that as well.
From day one, when I was promoted to a lieutenant 6 years ago, that was an assignment, officer wellness. Put something together, make sure there's annual trainings, and there's research on that you need to do the training annually.
Right.
It can't just be done in the police academy. You need to train people's minds to stay well, and you need to continue that support. And if you don't, they're going to fall off at some point. It might happen 12 years down the road. It might happen 25.
Right.
Or a lot of the suicides that I believe are not even included in those figures are after retirement.
Right.
Yes, they
And-
are. Yeah.
Actually, they are. They are included.
They are.
However,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
there's
they
a
are.
lot of them that go unnoticed. So if you retire, you move out of the country or
Yeah.
someplace else, we lose track. So it's 225 suicides, but I personally believe there's
It's
more.
more. Yeah.
It's interesting, though, because the departments I work with and the policy we have at DEA is that anyone who's involved in a traumatic event, it's not an optional thing. They are ordered. It's mandated on the clock. They get paid to go to meet with someone to be debriefed. This way, everyone gets it whether they want it or not. And what happens is you don't have to deal with the stigma. Well, I got to go speak to Aunt Perriello or Mike Miles because I'm ordered to go. Secretly, they're looking forward to go, but they
Right.
don't want to acknowledge
Right,
that
right.
because then they are
Exactly.
fearful they're going to be
Right.
viewed as,
So
I'm
good.
weak, I'm on the rubber gun squad, I
Right.
can't do this. So everyone gets mandated. So there was an event recently in Manchester, New Hampshire. There was a shooting. It was at a hotel. DEA and local law enforcement went. There were 3 bad guys dead. And everyone, so I went up to the DEA office and we did an automatic debrief with everyone. And the shooter who took the life, the kill shot of one of the bad guys, he didn't want to go. And they said, well, you're ordered to go. And he and I meet, a squared away guy. And at the end of it, he says, I didn't really want to go talk to you, but I'm glad I
Right,
did. And
right.
what happens is you get in front of these people. They may not need you that day, but
Yeah.
5 years down the road, hey, there was someone who came in, or 2
Right.
years down the road.
Yeah.
Can I talk to that guy? And Mike, you've had that experience many times where
Real quick, guys. We're going to take a quick break here, and then we'll continue that conversation.
Answering the
when we're
call.
back.
Since 1992, Genesis House has been helping real people heal from addiction on their private recovery campus in beautiful Palm Beach County, Florida. Their family-owned program is accredited by the Joint Commission and offers detox and dual diagnosis treatment in a comfortable and confidential setting. The First Responder Recovery Program at Genesis House is led by a doctorate-level therapist with direct professional experience as a first responder himself. Treatment modalities focus on psychiatric care, relapse prevention, stress management, and trauma-informed care for PTSD. Learn why their individualized approach makes a difference for first responders. Call Genesis House today at 1-800-737-0933 to speak with someone who understands. Visit them on the web at www.genesishouse.net. It's time to start your journey to a long and successful recovery.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Answering the call, the First Responder Podcast. I am the Podfather.
And I'm Jersey Ed.
Are you still here?
Yeah.
Get rid of you.
I'm trying to get rid of you. What was that during the break?
And we have our wonderful guest here,
Is this an EMS show?
Jeff and
Is
Ian.
this?
It's an
Are you
EM
an EMS? Who's an EMS there?
Jeff, his
Jeff.
past life.
previous life. And I hear some people from Jersey are looking for you.
Yeah, they are. They're always looking for me, man. Jersey.
So I just wanted to show my my beautiful patch here from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. A friend of ours was telling somebody up in Canada about our podcast, and he's been watching it, and he must have heed the warning and sent us a nice patch. I've
That's
never
cool.
seen one before, but there it is.
You got to put it the other way.
Yeah,
that hand. There you go.
is,
Put it. There
right
it is.
there, right
Mike.
there.
A little police trivia.
Yeah.
What's the most popular patch in America?
The most popular patch.
It's a new
I'd say NYPD.
NYC.
NYPD, right?
Well,
No?
sort of. They're the most prolific,
All right,
but
so
the ones that people want.
FDNY?
No, it's in Massachusetts. Think of a town with witches.
Oh, Salem.
Salem, really?
Yes.
Salem?
Yeah.
Salem PD.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the
Fine.
one everyone wants because the patch has a witch
That's
on a
right.
broomstick.
On a broomstick. That's
Salem, if
correct.
you're listening,
Reminded me of
send
one of
us a
my
patch.
ex-wives.
Yeah, Salem.
Right, yeah, I have 2 of those.
My alma mater.
Just kidding.
Salem
Well,
State.
they don't listen. Talk all
Not
about
normally.
one.
That's
Yeah,
right.
not
Salem-
normally, yeah.
Salem State School of Social Work. We have
Yep.
an alum,
That's right.
Mike Miles,
And a
we
future
have
alum.
Future alum,
Future
yeah.
alum. I like that.
Yeah, future alum.
That's
right.
Well done.
Perriello.
Great
Yeah.
school. Great school. And, you know,
It is.
Salem is a wonderful town. It really is. I can honestly say the 4 years of driving back and forth 3 days a week, I just really have like a...
That's funny, Mike. I thought it was a 2-year program.
It is. So welcome back, everybody.
Yeah. Well, we left off at, I have no idea where we left off, but Jeff was, I think, rambling on about something. And
Typical.
He's giving us some good stats.
Take it, Jeff.
I think we were talking about mandated police. I talked about the shooting up in Manchester, New Hampshire, where the DEA guys had to actually go through a mandated debriefing. And the benefits of that is that it sort of destigmatizes the process, and the people who perhaps need to go but are feeling uncomfortable about wanting to talk to the clinician. It makes it safe. And if they're squared away, they don't need it, great. And if they really benefit from it and want to take advantage of it, that's fine. Because, what do we know about, you were quoting statistics about police suicide. We know that there's a profile of people who kill themselves. And there's a lot of research on that. We don't always get it right, though, because there are people, you hear these things. He would be the last person I would ever think would want to take his life.
Sure.
And he does. So what goes on with someone who's like that? There's usually a list of things. Part of it is...
Retirement is one of them,
retirement,
isn't it?
right.
It's huge. I think it's the biggest out of it all, I'm guessing.
Perhaps not the biggest, but one of the contributing factors. So it's really... major depression is probably the most significant data. It's major depression, it's substance abuse disorders, it's a sense of hopelessness, social isolation, and the sort of tipping point tends to be that there's some event that occurs, usually like the death of a spouse, the loneliness that goes with that, or some sort of divorce and separation, and or job loss.
Right.
So people are lonely, they're isolated, and they're stuck with themselves. And I always say, when you're in that mindset, you are in bad company because you're with yourself. Right. So we know that people who break out of that and just talk to anybody. That's why 12-step meetings are fantastic. Yeah. No, everyone's an expert and no one's an expert. They're just human beings, and you can talk to them and talk about the experience. That's why the peer-to-peer support programs that police departments have, or the CISM programs, critical incident stress management, so important because you're talking to a fellow officer who knows what you're going through, and we actually prevent a lot of people from harming themselves, and they get assistance.
Yeah. And guys, reach out to your chief or somebody like Ann, because there are those programs out there. You may not even know about them. Especially we work with a lot of the Minnesota folks, the sheriff's department out there, and they have small little departments where there might be only 3 or 4 guys in the whole department, and you believe it or not, you probably do have somebody in those departments. It may not somebody be directly in your department. It might be like Beth Jordan. I mean, Beth Jordan is huge up there as far as we interviewed Beth. Right. You know Beth, right?
Yes,
Jeff?
Yes, she was the clinician. She's a lot of those folks. It's interesting because Mike Miles is one of those. Everyone knows who Mike is. He's been around a long time. So you work in another department that doesn't have a stress officer or an EAP clinician like Drake, for example. People will call Mike, and I'm sure this happens, Mike. You get calls, people don't even know you, but they got your name. Yep. And then you talk to them, and you help them and refer them, et cetera. And same thing in Pelham.
In New Hampshire, and I'm sure northern New Hampshire, you're probably looking at the sheriff's office or police departments up there that are probably next to nothing. And, I'm sure you had some of those calls, too, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely. And you... as a whole in the state of New Hampshire, like there's a Granite State stress management team. They end up traveling all the way up to Pittsburgh, which is on the Canadian border, and then down to Pelham, which is on the Mass border and borders Drake. They're covering a lot of area because there's more and more. The stigma is breaking, I think, Ed. I think the fact that we are aware that starting from the top down is changing, that it's changing slowly, but it is changing.
Right. Even before I went back to school in 1998 to get my degree, in 1987, myself and Tom Fleming, who was a Lowell police officer, a sergeant, he retired as a sergeant, we went to a seminar down in Pittsburgh, and it was about cops helping cops, and it was really just a very good summer. We paid for our own flight. We went down. We stayed in a hotel. We got a lot out of it. So when we came back, we decided we were going to put on a seminar. And we called our organization New Attitudes, and we had 160 attendees at our first seminar. We had speakers. We had a Dr. James Reese from the FBI Academy, Quantico, Virginia, who was just passed away recently. James Reese was without a doubt one of the smartest men I ever met. But he really was into police stress, and it was so good to hear, because I had my own problems back then. I was in early recovery. Fleming had problems. He had other things going on. But it was really nice to know that we weren't alone, and that there were actual people in law enforcement at a high end, FBI, and Jim Reese was one of the original profilers for people that committed these horrendous crimes.
We've got you.
You can edit that.
We got your back.
He basically, this guy was just head and shoulders above everyone. But we put on a seminar out in Framingham, and we had 160 attendees, and that was the beginning of starting helping cops. And where we are today, here we are 2020, and it's just amazing that people like Ann and other cops I've met that are getting involved in doing this. Because when I first come on, there was one cop in Boston, Eddie Donovan,
still around,
who was helping, and he had meetings and stuff. And poor Eddie got arrested shoplifting at Leechmere, and his credibility went out the window. But he never stopped helping people. Hey, nobody's perfect.
Well, Boston was one of the big peer supports, one of the first ones in the nation to do that, right? And was Eddie part of that?
Yep, he was.
So Eddie was
the original.
So Boston's actually the first municipal police department in the United States. We also are Massachusetts, the first state police organization, and the peer support program at BPD was the first peer support program through in Boston as well. It's interesting because as the clinician at DEA, they were one of the first federal agencies to do a EAP, and we have at DEA, it's called the trauma team. So agents get elected from their peers to go through the training. It's a 4-hour training, so I'm one of the instructors in the training, and we really train them on basic, sort of like psychology 101, how to relate to people, how to deal with trauma, how to take care of themselves in this process. And usually you get someone who has some psychological sort of a sophistication or awareness and empathy. And, the most important skill is to be able to relate to someone. Right. And all the research around how, quote, therapy is effective and successful, they identify one variable. It's not what type of training you have. It's not your ethnicity or gender. It's, I like the person I was talking to. Right. You like that person, you're going to automatically do better. So I was recently at the FBI Academy in Quantico 3 weeks ago, and we did a refresher class for the trauma team, and we just talk about, essentially self-care for the trauma team themselves, because we get, as clinicians, we also get secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, job burnout. So those things are also important, but that's the message. We all have to take care of ourselves. It's all about self-care.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Yeah, self-care is so important. Good. I'm sorry, Ann.
No, go ahead.
Like I always say, Mike, you and I always say this. It's okay not to be okay, just as long as you're going to do something about it. And that's, I think, what we have to get out to all these officers is that just because you're protecting somebody doesn't mean that you don't need protecting either. And you have to understand that it's okay not to be okay. And I think that's where your position, Ann, comes in. Jeff and Mike and all you guys who were trying to get the word out with the police officers,
sometimes I was just going to say, sometimes we all, we have bad days. But if you remind yourself, it's and unlike you, Ed, some people have bad hair days. But we do have Mike too. We do have bad days. But if we know it's only that day, right. In 24 hours you're going to feel better. Mm-hmm. Statistically, 1 out of 4 people in the United States at any given time has a problem with anxiety and or depression. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. That'd be you. So
that is definitely me.
Definitely
I take my T-pills.
Well, do whatever works.
That's right.
So and that is. It's interesting because we're all different people. So what may help me may not help someone else. Mm-hmm. So I may want to listen to music, or you may want to meditate, or talk to a person, etc., or exercise. Mm-hmm. But we know that there's some universal things that do help us. Part of our role is to just educate people. Here are the choices. Here are the options. You can take better care of yourself.
Well, Ann was talking about that before. With you guys are educating officers on food, healthy choices. Mike, how many times do you hear Mike on the show say, "Oh, he'd stop at McDonald's, slam down a hamburger, and then get back on the road"? What the hell does that do to your body, your mind, your thinking, your judgment? You know what I mean? All those shitty foods,
Yeah, you're not going to sleep well.
Nope.
And if you're not getting good sleep, you're not going to keep surviving.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, your battery is going to go low, and it's going to need to be recharged. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that you mentioned is being with someone that's comfortable and Just last week, I was helping Jeff with a law enforcement support group that he runs on Thursday afternoon. And there's an array of different officers from different agencies. Some can even come from Maine. They come from New Hampshire, Mass. It doesn't matter where you come from. You're coming to a common room where you have a connection automatically. And everyone's telling their story, and they're going through why they're there and what's bothering them. And you hear other stories, and you kind of look at it like, you know what, my situation isn't that bad. But part of what we talked about just last week, or it might have been the week before that, is it's like time restricted. So if you are like so overwhelmed and so stressed out, just make it to lunch. And then separate your day, make it to dinner, break it down, so that overwhelming feeling of just being depressed and having anxiety and not wanting to go to work, slow yourself down a little bit.
Compartmentalize the situation and then just get to that. Like we do in recovery, Mike, one day at a time.
One day at a time.
Early recovery, I was taking it 1 minute at a time. I was going to, not nothing like the officers go through, but I had my own struggles at the beginning, and I would take it an hour at a time. Like, okay, just God, let me make it to noontime without a thought or worrying about whatever that is. My case, it was trying to find cocaine or stay off the booze, but let me just make it that 1 hour. And we can apply that to any aspect of our life. We can apply that to anxiety. We can apply it to food, whatever it is,
That study that was done by the Department of Justice, and it was completed in 2017, what they found was, which was a stat that, didn't really surprise me, but correctional officers now are number one in the law enforcement field for the rate of suicide. And, police are number two. We used to be number one, but I think corrections, they're so isolated. They're so ingrained in everyday, mundane performances. They at least when you're a cop, you drive down the street, you might see something funny. You might have to, stop and talk to somebody, that will lift your spirits. So you're gonna see society. But when you're in a jail and you're dealing with the same people over and over again, and the upper management is nowadays, there's cameras everywhere. It's a really difficult job to perform nowadays compared to how it used to be.
It's interesting, Mike, because the point you bring up is that correctional officers are also doing time.
Right.
So they're locked up just like the prisoners.
Right.
Yeah, very good point.
And they don't have access. How many times do you look at your cell phone? How many times do you want to text your friend or children?
Or just see the sun or a flower or a blade of grass.
Exactly.
They don't see any of that shit, those guys. It's
a really tough job. And you're right. They have the highest rate of, any sort of law enforcement related field of suicide because they are constantly under scrutiny. If you ask a correctional officer what causes stress on the job, it's not the inmates.
No.
It's the administration.
Yes.
Because they're always being called out. And if you're a police officer and you can stop by, and we were talking earlier about the ability to not socially isolate, you can talk to people. You stop by the local watering, like a coffee shop, and get a lunch, or not the watering hole, but a coffee shop.
Used to be.
Used to be. Well, you can get a sandwich. And you have the ability to sort of interact. So we know there's a lot of research around brain chemistry and the ability to talk to someone. So when we look at addicted individuals who take a drug and they get these chemicals released in their brain and the synaptic flow of like things like serotonin and dopamine, if you talk to a person, you get the same reaction. Right. And there's a lot of studies about the ability to talk to people just makes you feel better. Mm-hmm. And when you're locked up in the joint, it's just so much harder to do that.
Right.
So that is always a concern. And the COs, they're the poor stepchild in the law enforcement field.
They really are. Mm-hmm. And the money is better than it used to be. I was very fortunate for 3.5 years to be able to, to go and work at the Sheriff's Department. And how I got that position was the original EAP, Paul Meehan. There was a suicide. A young officer committed suicide, and he was going to get coffees. He had a cruiser. He picked up everyone's coffee order, drove off the prison grounds, put the lights on, and shot himself in the head. And nobody can figure out what the hell just happened. He just paid his pool for the fantasy football. He had fantasy baseball. He had just planned a trip. He had just put in for his vacation.
He was also about to get married and go to, I think, Ireland.
Right. Something. I mean, everything was going good, and all of a sudden, he's driving down the street and he puts a gun to his head and shoots himself.
Mike, I remember you called me that night.
I did,
and we went to the jail to debrief a lot of people,
did.
And that saga that event still
Yeah.
is like chilling to so
Same
many
here.
people. Years later, I saw one of the responding police officers who told me he had this terrible event. He responded to this call of a suicide of a correctional officer. I said, I know, I was there that night also.
Right.
And that's the judgment that they make at that moment when you're deciding, am I even worth being around? And you are. It may not seem like it at that moment, like you were just saying, Ann. Give it an hour. Just make that decision in an hour. Don't do it right now, and see where you're at in another hour. Because when you pull that trigger, there's no turning back. And you're done. You're completely erased. Just think about it before you do it, and get some help. And like I said, it's okay not to be okay.
Right.
And I think part of what needs to also be educated is if an officer thinks or sees something with another officer that they don't like, if they start to see them getting depressed, isolating, they're drinking a lot, whether they're going through a divorce, they have financial issues, whatever it happens to be, if they think that is on the table, you need to ask straight out. And you don't ask, are you hurt? Do you want to hurt yourself? You need to ask straight out. Do you feel like killing yourself? Because there's a difference between hurting yourself and killing yourself.
Right.
And most of the time, people will tell you. And people think that that's such a scary question. But if you don't ask it, you don't want, obviously, to say, you know what, I saw the signs. And it starts from the top down. And we just had a captain from Nashua Police Department take his life, John Leto. It's been very public. The chief spoke to his family, and the Nashua Police Department's chief, Mike Carrigan, he's been very public, put out a whole letter about stigma, about it's time to break it. There was a huge fundraiser at a gym that I belong to that Mike Carrigan put together on a Saturday morning for Helping Heroes to raise money for American Suicide Foundation. There is support out there. Like, people are not alone.
And it's really good, like, to have someone like yourself, Ian, who's going into this field, with the degree in social work and being able to help people. Because I know, as a cop that got sober in 1986, I was 32 years old. Prior to getting sober, going to see a psychiatrist or a doctor, I wasn't going to be honest with them and tell them that I was thinking of hurting myself, because I didn't want to lose my ability to carry a firearm and be a cop. And, when people come into my office or Jeff's office, cops and correctional officers and firemen, and I have an 8-page evaluation. It's on there 3 times. I ask you 3 times, do you have suicide ideations? Have you thought about killing yourself? Couple more questions. Have you thought about hurting yourself? When is the last time you thought about it? And people will say, you just asked me that question. I said, well, I'm going to ask you a 3rd time too. Have you? Because lots of times nobody wants to admit it. I'm not going to take away your ability to work. I just want to know where you're at. And if you
but Mike, that you and you guys probably know this all too well. That's your pride and joy, the badge and the gun. And if you say those words, your life will be. You think your life is going to be taken away. That badge and that gun's going to go away very quickly. You're going to get some help, but it's going to be temporary. And that's why you can't identify yourself as. You can't live as a police officer. You have to live as a human being first, and then live as a police officer. Because, you take yourself out of the equation, commit suicide. There's a lot of things. I mean, look at how it affected you guys. You didn't even know the gentleman, but can you imagine what it's doing to the family? What financial problems it's going to cause the fammy?
The emotional,
emotional, just everything, and because you just decide at that moment. So, you got to think before that even happens. And you know what? And I would even say, tell on somebody, be a fucking rat. You know what? At least that person's going to get some help. They may not like you at time, but you know what? Maybe a week later or 2 weeks later or a year later, they're going to say, you know what? Thank God, Chanchu did say that.
We would not say it's a rat. We would say it's an advocate.
Strength in numbers.
But when somebody's in it, they're gonna think that motherfucker's turned on me. He told my dark secret.
And then what do you say to yourself? I'd rather have him alive and be pissed off.
Absolutely.
And then what happens later? They thank you. So famous study, Golden Gate Bridge study. The Golden Gate Bridge was built many years ago, connects San Francisco Bay. They built a 4-foot fence. People were jumping. 6-foot jumpers. 8-foot people are jumping. 10-foot people are jumping. One particular year, a period of 18 months, 13 people jump off. They live. Remarkable study. This is the closest study you can get to someone who is actually, dying but lived. They live. They interview all these people. here was the question that came up. So when you jumped off the bridge, what were you thinking about at that point once you leaped off? And they all said to a person, oh, I made a terrible mistake. This is probably not what I should have done. So based upon that data, numbers are small, but it's highly significant that we know that people who actually take their lives, if they come to terms with what it really meant, they would regret it and not do it. Unfortunately, most of those people don't survive.
What a great study.
Yeah.
Hey, what a great show this has been.
Absolutely, Jeff. Good to see you again.
Yeah.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you for doing this.
And
thanks
thank
for being
you.
here.
Yeah, absolutely. And please feel free to guys anytime you want to come on, Jeff. Maybe we'll see you on our other show.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good.
Answering the call.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
That concludes this episode of Answering the Call, the First Responder Podcast. Thanks to Genesis House for sponsoring the show and supporting our first responders who are struggling with addiction and mental health. Follow us on Facebook for past shows and updates. If you are interested in becoming a guest on the show, email us at help@friendsandrecoverypodcast.com.